I'm delighted to welcome you to this book launch in celebration of the publication of Unlocked Online Therapy Stories by Anastasia Piatakhina Giré. We're delighted to have her here, and of course our other panelists, Kate and Mark. My name is Christina Whitperry, and I'm Publishing Director for Confer and Carnac Books. It's the new publishing arm of Confer Limited. And I'm here to introduce our speakers and to tell you a bit about the publication of Unlocked. But first, I need to get a few housekeeping matters out of the way. Just to let you know that this is a Zoom webinar. So what that means is that you can see us as panelists. There are a lot of online guests. And you will see us as speakers, but we can't see you and you can't see each other. We're going to have a Q&A for part of this session, and so we ask you to ask any questions that you have for the panelists, for our authors and speakers, in the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar, and to reserve the chat for other matters such as technical issues and telling us where you're from, for instance, so that our facilitators can come and help you if you have any problems. We also have a raise hand function. So if you as a audience member would like to ask a live question from any of our panelists, then you need to use the raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and our facilitators will then be able to open up your communication so that you can ask your question live. Just so that you know, I think you've all been notified that the event is being recorded. And also the Q&A will be preserved, so we'll be able to send that to you after the event. The structure of the event is my short introduction, and then the introduction of the speakers Kate, Anthony and Anastasia will have a conversation for about 15 to 20 minutes, and there will be some short readings from the book. And then Mark Payne will also read some passages from the book. That will be followed by the Q&A, and the event will end around 7:30. So now it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you our two first speakers. So if I could ask Anastasia and Kate to turn on their videos and their audio now. Anastasia is our author, our esteemed author, and she is accredited with the UK Council for Psychotherapy and European Certificate of Psychotherapy. She's practiced therapy for a decade with clients online from around the world in 4 languages, which I think is incredibly impressive. And she now lives and works in Paris, France, and is finalizing her PhD at the Middlesex University in London. I don't know whether that's actually finished yet or not. Maybe you can tell us, Anastasia. And she's also a faculty member of the Online Therapy Institute in London. And Dr. Kate Anthony is a psychotherapist and co-founder of the Online Therapy Institute. And for the past 25 years, she has trained several thousands of clinicians and coaches worldwide in using digital tools in their services. And it's great to have this opportunity to hear Anastasia and Kate speaking about Unlocked, which is a book that came to us here at Confer Books quite early on in the process of starting our publishing company about 2 years ago. And in fact, I looked back and saw that Anastasia and I started communicating about this in June of 2020. So it's coming up to 2 years. That's about how long it takes to actually produce and publish a book. And we're absolutely delighted to be publishing it and releasing it to the world. So I'll pass over to you two now.
Thank you, Christina. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Anastasia joined my team at the Online Therapy Institute as a result of the sudden rush of people seeking training we had because of COVID-19. So I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing and helping launch this book, which I think is a great read, a really good addition to anyone's library about the fields of online counselling and psychotherapy. I'd like to start with a short reading from the book, which I think will give you a flavour of it. It won't have as much context as reading the actual book will, but I think it's got little vignettes I can give you as an audience to help you understand where the book is placed on the range of, if you like. Those who know me know that I read and I write a lot of textbooks. And one of the things that's been a real pleasure for me in reviewing this book for Confer and Karnak is that it is very much stories. It's not a textbook, and I wouldn't want people to be seeking a how-to guide from this book, because the beauty of it is that it isn't. It's a beautiful book of stories about the clients, and that's where we should all be centered, of course. So let me start by introducing you a bit to Claudio, who turns up about halfway through the book. Okay. So next time I switch on the camera, secretly looking forward to my weekly portion of Roman spring, Claudio connects from indoors. His heavy body is awkwardly stuck between an empty wall and a desk. Without his usual baseball cap, his balding is obvious. It's raining today, he grumpily explains the change of scenery. I can tell that he is edgy, unsettled. Is it uncomfortable for you to let me into your flat via the video? He stares above the top of the screen and his face expresses disgust, the same emotion he usually conceals when he jokes about himself. Women do not show up here too often, he recognizes, but don't expect too much of it, he snaps in surprisingly aggressive manner. I am taken aback, slightly embarrassed about my own curiosity about his interior. Meeting with clients through the webcam has taught me to pay attention to their surroundings and open to my senses to what they decide to show, consciously or not, to make me understand their story. Now, I chose that passage because I think it's a lovely example where, not being a textbook, Anastasia has been able to focus away from the technical terms that we use in counselling and psychotherapy, and more towards the lyrical and the ability to tell a story behind that. So my first question to you, Anastasia, was how you managed to avoid that. It's something I find very difficult to avoid in my work because there is so much technical terminology in our profession, and it's very reassuring to rely on those terms. I think in this passage, the terms that occurred to me were transference and countertransference. So I wanted to ask you if it was difficult to be away from that, or did it exclude itself automatically because of the story writing process?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for being here. Yes, it came rather naturally to me to avoid technical language. I really find that professional jargon gets in the way of telling the story. So once I decided to tell a story, then it kind of goes away and fades into, the ether, which is a good thing, I guess. And also wanted this book to be appealing and a good read for those who are not therapists and maybe are considering to try therapy. So I really wanted to inspire people on both sides of the screen, basically, to give it a go. So avoiding technical language was crucial. And I guess this is how I talk with my clients as well. We don't use those words in the therapist session. So it seemed natural to talk in the same way with my readers.
Okay. Could you tell me a bit more about what you consider to be your core theoretical orientation, so that we know where your work with the client is lying?
Yeah, so I'm trained as an integrative therapist, and I consider myself as such, but also kind of relational perspective is really important. So I guess kind of person-centered could also fit into this. existential, probably yes, because I do think that it's, you know, as Dr. Yalman sees, it's not, you know, an approach, but it's a way of practicing therapy, really. So existential part is there as well. So it's quite eclectic, and I do try to reinvent therapy for every client. So sometimes I will do maybe a more kind of CBD almost, or CBD you know, work. Sometimes it will be much more existential. But it's always kind of rooted in that relational aspect, because I do think that the therapeutic relationship is really central to the work.
Yeah, and I will touch again on existentialism as my last reading from the book, which I think is explains that point really well. Okay, I'm just going to cough, excuse me. Apologies for that. And I'm going to read a bit about Jane. And I wanted to concentrate on Jane because Jane is the one that takes you out of the office, out of your consulting room, in what seems to me to be quite a roller coaster of a chapter, of a story. Let me read and I'll explain a bit more. So, next time we connect, Jane is in her car again. Her phone is placed in the holder and the image is steady. She looks even more exhausted than the previous time. I am hungover, Jane announces flatly. Drinking has always been the escape route that Jane takes when things become unmanageable or out of control. There is something rebellious and stubborn in her voice, which reminds me of my teenage daughter again. Last time we met, you mentioned that you were 13 when your parents' obsession with dogs started. Jane nods, slightly surprised by my question. Do you remember what was going on in your family at that time? I see Jane's face freezing, which confirms that we are onto something. She stays silent for several long seconds, then turns away from the camera, looks outside in the direction of the cottage. Let's get out of here. She turns the key, which was already in the ignition, and before I can protest, the Mini takes off. This is the first time a patient takes me for a drive. I'll show you around. As Jane accelerates down the village road, I observe her face, unable to read her expression. Determination, anger, fear, anxiety? I'm not sure. The sounds of the engine and the speed with which we are leaving behind the small houses, the trees, make me realize that we are going fast. In a few minutes, the sudden change of light confirms we are now on the coastal road. I can spot the silvery sea shimmering on Jane's right when the car makes a particularly sharp turn. A road trip session is certainly not a mainstream modality, and I'm losing all control over what is going on. Any semblance of therapeutic boundaries or the sanctity of the therapy room has been stretched to vanishing point. Jane is the one in the driving seat, and I suddenly realize she can launch her car off the cliff, taking me with her, and I will be unable to do anything to prevent this from happening. I have no option but to wait, hoping that she has an agenda, and it is not suicide in the company of her online therapist. Now, I chose that passage because it brings up boundaries. And I think not only is it a great demonstration of the flexibility of boundaries and how they often have to shift because of the client-centered nature of the work. And as you said, Jane is in the driving seat in this instance. It very much gives the client autonomy to run the session. And this I found very reminiscent of a lot of the stories I heard during the pandemic, particularly in the early days. Several therapists, rather than using the consulting room, did use their cars, not while driving, but to park opposite each other. So there was still a face-to-face communication going on. I found that very interesting. So my question to you about this part, Anastasia, is how comfortable you've been with letting the client be in the driving seat, because there is boundary stretching a lot of ways, but the nature of the global pandemic and having to shift the way we work because of it, how much input has that pandemic had on your comfort with stretching those boundaries?
In my particular case, it didn't impact my work that much because I have been working online well before the pandemic. So I guess kind of, having to take the risks with the client has been part of my work for a long time. And, you know, I mean, in therapy in general, online or in person, clients are meant, they expected to take risks, right? They stretch themselves, they reveal themselves, they do it despite the shame they can feel. And I think it's important that as therapists, we also take some risks to meet them somewhere halfway. And in the online therapy, these opportunities present themselves all the time. The example of Jane is a very fictionalized, of course, and kind of traumatized version of it. Things usually do not get that dramatic in the real life therapy, but they also can happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen every day, but it can happen. And when this happens, we have to make a decision in the moment, in the here now of the session. What do we do about it? And I think we have to rely on our intuition, really, at that point. We rarely have time to think it through in the moment. That kind of thinking, usually the theoretical thinking, catches up later on when, you know, I take my notes or I think about or reflect or write about a session. But in the session, of course, we don't have the leisure and the time, the space of doing that.
Yes, so, yeah. I was trying to think of an equivalent in face-to-face, well, in my own face-to-face work, of having to go with the moment and running with it. And the only thing I could come up with was when I was working for the NHS in Southeast London many moons ago, a wasp flew into my consulting room through an open window, and I have quite a fear of wasps. And so suddenly I froze, although was aware that I was with the client, and so my attention was there. But it was my client who recognized my fear and got up and dealt with the wasp. And I let them do it because, well, I was in a state apart from anything else. But again, it wasn't till later that I had a chance to think about the whole background of the client saving the therapist. And we can overthink these things sometimes, but in general, it was a useful learning curve for me. So yes, it's and I think there's also a lesson there in recognizing those of us who have been doing this for many years, pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. We do get to a state of not expecting things like that to happen, but being prepared at all times for that shift to happen.
Yeah, and you know, I think, and again, as I have been in tutoring and talking with people about, you know, how to deal with these situations, basically, usually what you know comes up is that to be ready to discuss it in the session openly, you know, is always, you know, helpful. So I'm wondering how after that wasp's intrusion, how did you manage to talk it through with the client post factum and kind of discuss how it was for him or for her to save you suddenly from this, you know, terror and this attack?
Yes.
You know, and that can usually, that brings up, or I would even say always brings up, some very useful material for therapy. Yes,
it's often a good route into that sort of thing. I'm not going to give spoilers on what happens at the end of the drive with Jane, because it's a great read and I'd like people to discover that for themselves. So we'll move on to Philip. Okay. So Anastasia starts by asking, what brings you here today? I dreaded this question, Philip exhales with disarming honesty, which makes me instantly like him. We sit in silence, considering his fear and his confusion. His square face, creased with deep lines all over, remains strangely shut, and his dark gaze is wandering elsewhere. I can tell that he's not used to translating his own feelings into words. It takes him a long moment to utter, I am lost. As he finally looks at me, I can see agony in his eyes. When did you start feeling this way? I don't know, it happened gradually. I kept trying to focus on work, on resolving other people's problems, you know? A fleeting smile crosses his face, but nothing makes much sense anymore. I get his irony. Bearing in mind that Philip is a colleague, his existential struggle resonates with a particular intensity. If the loss of meaning is a major issue for anybody, for a therapist it can turn into a nightmarish experience. Being constantly exposed to human dramas, therapists are vulnerable to this blight. Therapy is a meaning-making activity. A therapist in loss of meaning becomes inept. How do you cope with your work? I mostly don't anymore, he acknowledges and looks away. Philip's practice has been dying slowly and the lockdown dealt it a final blow. At the beginning, I kept meeting with a few clients over the phone, but now there's only one left who still turns up. She's probably too depressed and embarrassed to end it, he concludes with barely disguised relief. What about your family? He just shrugs at my question, and it takes us another while to get to the bottom of his despair. His wife left him the year before to move in with their neighbour, and his life has been shrinking farther as he isolated himself out of embarrassment and pain. As the pandemic forced the village pub to close down, he lost his last connection with the outside world. I don't even know what I'm hoping for, he says, looking at me with dismay. I'm sorry to inflict this onto you. My heart goes out to him and the words pour out of my mouth without premeditation. Please do not. Your lostness is also mine and anybody else's for that matter. Just human, right? He smiles again, this time for a split second longer. Or maybe that's what I wish to believe. We agree on giving it a go and I switch off. And when I switch off, remote and rural keeps coming back to me. I imagine him pouring himself a large glass of whiskey after talking with me, dismayed at the closest pub and his own existence, the emptiness of which has only been highlighted further by the stormy night and the lockdown. Something in Philip's not fitting with his world resonates with me. Will I be able to capitalise on this resonance and help him reclaim his life? And this is a passage I chose, Anastasia, because of the humanity in it. And that resonation you talk of with Philip shows how the two professionals working together, which also has an element of peer supervision in it, I guess. I think actually that's my question. How did you, because Philip is a fellow professional, there's an element of peer supervision can be seen in the work, even if it's not planned or intentional by any other observer. So what I wanted to ask you to clarify was how you managed to separate those potentially difficult dual relationship elements of that work.
I have quite a few therapists as clients. I always do, and I really enjoy working with fellow therapists. It's always, therapy is always a very kind of delicate act of balance in general, but with therapists, it's even more so. And it takes a lot of humility, but also a lot of stubbornness, I guess. So it's always a good challenge. And you're absolutely right, the elements of supervision usually kind of sneak in. It's impossible to keep that away. What usually happens at the beginning in the first stage of therapy, that happens less, and then probably with time, as the relationship develops, that maybe happens a little bit more. And I always try to capitalize on therapist knowledge and understanding and experience, even if sometimes that it is it's impossible to keep that out of the room. Mm-hmm. So I welcome that, and we use it and usually work as a team. Really, I prefer to see therapy as a dialogue, and as and I usually see my clients, no matter what they do in life, as my equals, so they know often better. They really do. They do know their lives better, and therapists even more so.
So again, it's that human to human element of, and I think that part of the work, as I said previously, been so important during the events of the last couple of years. Okay, so I'll pass back to Christina, but I do want to say that I do recommend this book to participants as an essential part of your learning about nuances and delights of holding an online practice. Obviously, we're fans, we train. And as I said at the beginning, it's not a textbook, but it brings client stories to life in a way that few textbooks can, even with the best case studies that we produce. I think by turning it into a work of literature, it's given me a deeper understanding of how the work can happen and how it works globally as well, because it is a very international book. Your clients are spread all over the place. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. Thanks, Anastasia. I'll pass back to Christina.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Anastasia, for that. And those were wonderful passages and such pertinent questions, I think, for Anastasia about her work and how, you know, the online practice develops the work itself, and how the two kind of go hand in hand. So thank you so much for that. I now have the pleasure of inviting Mark to open his video and his audio, and Anastasia and Kate can go into the background. I'm delighted to introduce Mark as a friend and colleague of Anastasia's. He's also a counselor and coach with training in neuro-linguistic programming and cognitive behavioral therapy. He's got 10 years experience of working with addicts and alcoholics, and is also a former teacher, so has lots of life experience, it sounds like. And he runs one-to-one sessions in private therapy, where he focuses on narrative therapy with adults and adolescents. I hope I've got all of that right, Mark. And Mark has very kindly offered to read us a few more sections of Anastasia's wonderful book. So I'll pass it over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina, Anastasia, and Kate. I also selected a different part of the story from Jane, which personally as a reader I found very powerful, very powerful. It reads almost like a thriller. So I'm going to read a different excerpt. And so Jane, London, UK. By the time Jane returns home, we have both grown tired and mildly frustrated with her therapy progress. She keeps connecting for our erratic sessions from different hotel rooms, various Starbucks of the world, and even faraway airports. I never know from which place she will call me next, and this inconsistency rattles me a lot. This up-in-the-air, unpredictable lifestyle has been Jane's reality for more than a decade. She is a freelance journalist living out of her suitcase, covering migration flows, populations, fleeing wars and refugee camps. Sometimes I wonder what Jane's deeper reason for being in therapy is. She mutters something about her anxiety, and I am left with my questions again, free to guess and no clear answer, at least not yet. The fast-spreading COVID pandemic finds Jane back in London, where she is crashing on her friend's couch, preparing for her next assignment, which was meant to take her to South Sudan. With her departure to Africa delayed, Jane makes the hasty decision to go back to Scotland, to spend the lockdown at her parents' house in her native village. After all, she needs rest and sleep, and there she has at least a decent-sized room and has no need to cook or do her own washing. Jane is resolved to recover from years of not sleeping enough or sleeping in all kinds of uncomfortable or unsafe surroundings. I secretly hope that this forced stop on her peregrinations will help us to catch our breath in therapy too. When I suggest that we continue our sessions during lockdown, Jane reluctantly agrees, but I already doubt that this will happen. Several months into her therapy, I still know nearly nothing about Jane's hometown or her childhood. Not only has she been avoiding these topics with determination and skill, but also her crisis-fueled life has been providing us with plenty of other, more urgent matters to attend to. Jane has been busy surviving dangerous situations, under constant pressure. Fearless and always ready to accept a new assignment, Jane is a good journalist and always seems to be in high demand. I sit in front of my screen waiting for Jane, and I am slightly anxious as I know that she will not be able to hide from her past anymore. In her childhood home, it will certainly find a way to catch up with her. I've never been to Scotland and have always dreamed of going. So now I'm excited, almost as if Jane were taking me there with her. When she finally logs in, the image on my screen is out of focus. She is using her iPad as usual. The connection is pretty bad here, not much better than what we are used to, she announces, warning me already about the imperfections of her hometown. Despite her words, her face is now clear on my screen. This is the very first time I can see her so well. Jane's back-at-home version is wearing an old, oversized white t-shirt, which makes her thin arms look girlish. She looks exhausted. Her usual energy, fueled with anxiety and work pressure, has gone or been left behind in London. Since I came back, I've not been sleeping well. It's too quiet. I forgot about how eerie it can get here, she complains. Dark circles under her blue eyes confirm this. With the lockdown, the coastal village, emptied of the usual flow of tourists, has fallen into despair. The closure of the restaurants has put fishermen out of work for the time being. With the pubs shut, the atmosphere is grim. Jane's own work is frozen, and the Western world suddenly became uninterested in dramas happening elsewhere. What is happening here is consuming all our attention, resources, and capacity to care. How does Jane feel about this? Angry, very angry. And as soon as the word anger has been uttered out loud, something shifts. A knot that was growing in my stomach releases ever so slightly. But Jane is not ready to let too much emotion either out or in, and retreats quickly back to her protective, anxiety-filled shell. Is there anything else that may explain her sleepless nights at home? Jane is not volunteering much, so I'm left guessing again. I hate doing this from home, Jane states grimly, her irritation growing. Almost as a reaction to her words, a rumbling noise erupts from the bowels of the house. Jane turns away from the camera and towards the door off screen to me. Now I can clearly distinguish the doors trembling and the dogs barking. Sorry, wait a sec. Jane jumps up, leaving her iPad, with me inside, behind, but has no time to reach the door before two big black dogs burst loudly into the room. For several seconds, I am watching Jane scream and push angrily, trying to get rid of the growling intruders. Finally, she is able to expel them and locks the door before returning to face me. Nasty beasts, she puffs. There's no way of avoiding them here. What are they? Belgian shepherds. My parents are obsessed with them. She moves her iPad, showing me the rest of the room, and I can spot a large, uncannily realistic picture of the same black dogs hanging just above the single bed. When I go to sleep, I have to turn it to face the wall. I can't stand it. Jane looks genuinely upset. They are not completely unfriendly, but there is something creepy about them. My father named them Shock and Shuck. Can you believe it? Jane shrugs in disgust. When did it start, your parents' obsession with dogs? I don't remember exactly. A long time ago. I was maybe 13 or so when they got their first dog. We sit in silence for a while as Jane seems to be transported back to the time when dogs had not been part of the family. Her gaze is vacant, and I wait for her to recollect her memories. Our hour is almost up. I will have to wait to ask my next burning question. There's a real storytelling flair with each of these stories. And I chose Jane because I found it gripping, but I've also chosen to read from a story about Alan. One of the strengths of this book, I find, is how it mixes the story of the patient, the experience of the pandemic, but also kind of the experience of the therapist as well. And I really like the way these things came together in this story. So Alan, Manhattan, New York. I'm in a terrible dilemma. With his striped Italian shirt, Alan, neatly shaven and perfectly groomed, sounds like a soap opera character. His eyes as blue as his shirt, look tired. Alan is a high-ranking officer in the New York Police Department. During his lunch break, he has locked himself into his top floor office in Manhattan to connect with me for our very first session. In Paris, it is already dusk, and he is my last client of the day. At least I will not bump into a colleague from the bureau at your front door, he explains with a charming smile. Indeed, he will not. Our offices are thousands of miles apart. I realize that Alan has considered all his options before going for an online therapist from far away. With my European accent, I probably sound exotic to him. When I ask, he shrugs, eager to move on to business. Alan's trouble started a year ago, when Chloe burst into the then well-organized and contented married life. They met at Alan's yacht club, where she was working as a bartender. Since then, his existence has been divided into two parts, neatly separated by the East River, and this situation has grown increasingly intolerable. Alan must find a solution to his dilemma, and my clearly stated task is to help him take the right decision, choosing between his wife and his lover. It sounds like a clearly defined job. but something rattles me from inside. I do not believe that this is all there is to it. As I listen to Alan describing his situation in a measured way, I can spot behind him a striped white and green flag alongside his department's motto, Fidelis ad mortem, faithful till death, an ironic reminder of his current conflict. Our first hour is entirely dedicated to his praising both women's unquestionable virtues. Alan keeps talking, and I imagine an Alan child in a sweet shop presented with too many choices. Alan's wife is a medical doctor. They have a nice penthouse in the East Village and 2 French bulldogs. I know I should be a happy man. Alan's attempt to persuade me does not work. He does not look convinced either. Tell me more about your marriage. I try to refocus on the relationship rather than the characters of Alan's drama. My wife is a strong woman. I admire her, respect her, but Alan is not fooled easily. He keeps on his tracks, well polished by a year of ruminating. What kind of relationship do you have? My question takes Alan by surprise. Is there such a thing as a relationship with sweets? We are good. We make a perfect crew, I guess. Alan is into sailing, and here we are talking about the boat he has been actively rocking for the last year. Something in Alan invites sarcasm. I struggle to join him in his place of emotional torture, and yet tortured he feels. What about your relationship with Chloe then? As soon as I pronounce the magic spell of his lover's name, Alan's face lights up. She's such a breath of fresh air. But I'm not sure he can live with so much fresh air without catching a chill. Alan seems used to the coziness of his relationship with his reliable wife. Alan, but what did you mean when you referred to a perfect crew? I acknowledge my lack of sailing references. Trusting each other to do the right thing, I guess. Do you trust yourself to do the right thing? I used to, at least at work, but now, no, not anymore. I wait for a few long seconds, watching the gloomy waves of doubt transpiring through Alan's skin. I actually doubt it strongly, he admits, and a few drops of sweat appear on his suntanned forehead. What makes you doubt? Chloe. I will not hear more about Chloe today, as our time is up. As Alan's face leaves my screen, my own past takes over, and a familiar face fades in. The same inescapable charm, the same restless blue eyes. André was my teenage crush, 10 years my senior. He chose to become a policeman, a career that I dreamed about while at high school. For several years, our relationship dithered on the thin edge between romance and friendship. The latter eventually won, and the complicity we then shared still makes me smile today. André died 2 decades ago, caught up in a complex, thriller-like inquiry into drug trafficking. He was shot in an ambush set up by his corrupt colleagues. His idealism and righteousness were incompatible with their practices and the blurred boundaries between police and crime during the immediate post-Soviet anarchy. André's ghost has been sleeping in some dark corner of my mind, but is now awakened by Alan. I watch him making himself comfortable in one of the armchairs reserved for the clients who come to my office in Paris. He winks at me in that unique manner that made my teenage heart go faster and lights up a cigarette, but I can hardly protest. I make sure the door of my office is firmly shut before I join my family in the living room next door. Working from an office in the family apartment is obviously practical, but it also comes with thinner boundaries between the 2 areas of my life. Okay. And well, thank you for inviting me to read those excerpts. I thoroughly enjoyed all of the book, and I recommend it to anybody who likes a good story or is interested in the subject area.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for giving the voice to the stories.
Yes.
It's the first time I'm hearing them, read. It's really...
Yeah. So I resisted the temptation to do any accents, which I'm sure is a great relief for all of the attendees. So.
Oh, what a shame. We might have enjoyed that. You never know.
Especially the Russian bit.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Kate to turn on her video and join us for the Q&A session, which I'd like to start off. We have a question here from Swarnima, and she says, hello, how have you worked in embodied ways in online therapy, especially when working with binge eating?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have worked with binge eating in particular online. I did in person, but I guess almost anything that can be done in person in the office can be done in online therapy. There are obviously some exceptions. I probably would be very careful with anger work, for example. But yeah, so I guess there's no a big difference in the way I would do it. The online brings in some kind of immediate, very immediate information, so I guess I would use the fact that the client is in her own home, not far from the fridge, not far from the food he usually would binge on. So I guess, but I'm inventing as I go. I would probably at some point use that somehow, but I would let the client guide me. And that's again, the client being in the driving seat, like in Jane's example. Usually clients do know where to drive. It's not always, that information isn't always readily available to them, but deep down, I think they do know. They have an agenda and we have to listen. So I'm not sure if I answered the question.
No, I was just going to add to that, Anastasia. In more general terms, the work of wider technologies in our profession, there's a lot of really good work involving eating disorders, binge eating, anorexia, to do with virtual reality. And the clients find, research shows us that clients find being able to objectify is a tricky word to use in this context, but be able to project themselves into an avatar of how they think they look, whatever the reality is, and how that affects the self-esteem, and working with a therapist alongside them. I think eating disorders in virtual reality, treatment of eating disorders in virtual reality is a really, really important point for the future of that type of work with that client base.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Yes, that makes complete sense, but it's not something I personally do.
Yeah, my experience of that particular range of clients isn't wide either.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for those very interesting answers. I just wondered if anyone wanted to ask a question live. If you are interested in speaking to our panelists, please do use the raise hand function. I have something in the chat here. So here's a question from Stephen. I'm so pleased to see this much needed book published. Sorry, it's just jumped away from me. We need more stories of what therapy is like, and COVID taught us that we all need to know what it is like when offered online. Is the book aimed most at potential clients or at professionals working online, or is it both?
Oh, it's really both. My hope is that this book can be enjoyed by people on both sides of the screen. And I really wrote it aiming on both, and I was really, as I was writing, I was thinking about really both therapists and clients. And again, as we kind of mentioned before, therapists can also be clients, right? And clients can become therapists. I've seen both happening. So it's not so different.
Yes, well, I mean, I can speak to that question as well, actually, which is that in commissioning this book and in working with Anastasia, I certainly believe, not being a therapist myself, that it is very much a book for both, or for indeed anyone who is interested in therapy generally, online therapy maybe more specifically. But what's wonderful about this book is that it makes the experience of therapy, both from the therapist's point of view and from the client's point of view, very accessible, because it's written in those story forms that are easy to digest and easy to relate to. And I think that's one of the real successes of what you've done, Anastasia.
Well, thank you, Christina.
It also occurred to me that it's a style of writing and a topic of writing that can be replicated with many clients going forward. Or, I mean, I'm probably not the only person desperate for an update on Jane, but this future editions, I think, is something I would look forward to.
More online therapy stories, right?
Yeah.
Definitely an option there.
It's certainly an option. I definitely have many stories to tell, which I was previously doing in my blog, but it's obviously much more satisfying to put them together in the form of a book. It gives it a completely different shape.
Mark, would you like to rejoin us?
Sure.
I was quite curious actually to find out from you a bit more about your use of narrative therapy and how that connects potentially with the type of storytelling that Anastasia is doing in her book.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know how it would directly connect with Anastasia's work, but the narrative therapy work I've looked at is basically centered around the stories that people tell themselves. That we can often give ourselves a role or a character in our lives. Classics would be the hero, the victim, the scapegoat, the joker, and trying to help people challenge the roles that they've assigned themselves, which they've very often picked up in their family of origin, and helping them challenge those ideas and see where the role that they're playing is not helping them in wherever they are in their current situation with their job or their relationship, and how they can sort of reframe that in their own mind.
I guess in a way that's what my characters do in the book a lot, right? In telling their stories, in a way I hope to allow them to tell the story, and that's exactly what happens in therapy. And once we tell the story, and even now that I'm hearing you reading the stories I've wrote, it actually, the story takes a different shape, and some aspects of it become more obvious, and we can then question them. So I think it's important to keep telling those stories in any shape or form that, you know, comes comfortable to us, and that's what I try to do. Yeah.
Okay, and now we've had a few more questions come in, so this is good.
Warming up.
Warming up the audience. I have a question here from Sharon, who says, and I think this is an interesting one: initially in starting online work, I found it had a numbing or deadening effect on my body. Perhaps as I wasn't receiving the bodily communications directly. Is this something you recognize?
Yes, it does definitely ring a bell. I can relate to that. What probably happens is also that now I'm very used to it, so it happens probably much less. But it used to happen, and I'm wondering if, and I'm actually curious about what Kate has to say about that. She probably has even much more to say than I do. But maybe there is also something about the fact that, you know, when we focus on the screen, it takes actually a lot of energy to keep kind of focused on this little bit of, you know, material, and we get a lot of clues from the client. They're different. You know, they're obviously much more limited, but they're very powerful though. and keeping the focus on this, on the close-up, on the face. We usually don't do that in the real life, right? Our eyes wander around, we kind of look elsewhere, we look at the books, we look at the room. And when we work online, this is much harder. So usually, and that's recognized by any therapist, I think, who works online a lot during the day, especially a few sessions in a row, then we get tired. It's exhausting. It's often much more tired than working in person because we have to stay really, really focused.
Yes, that focus is a stretch for a lot of people. And a lot of it is to do with the fact we don't move our eyes as much as we do when we're in room with someone. But what I focus on with my trainees is the intentionality of the process. So to keep that energy level up, you're constantly aware of your own, where your energy levels are, and paying attention to any deadness inside from a transferential point of view, of course, that this may be something that's coming from your client, and the countertransference might just be playing out like that. Because I've done some work in the last year with transpersonal therapists, and from that point of view, the person-to-person elements, despite the fact the screen is there, what I call presence, or what's now known as presence. Previously, it would have been called telepresence, but I think that's overstretching a point. But that presence between two people, intentionally there to intentionally reach a goal, whatever that co-journey has been towards that, or will be towards that, is enough to keep my energy levels up. And also transitioning into out of sessions, much more important than when you're doing our offline work, in my opinion. Intentionally clearing the brain, walking around the garden, whatever it is, even making a cup of tea, intentionally to give yourself that pause between clients and helping you to be present and energized with them. But it is something that I think requires practice.
Yeah, it does. And I also noticed that, working online with clients who are used to this online kind of dialogue is very different from those working with those who are not. So if your client is really uncomfortable or not convinced about the whole thing, really having doubts and feeling a little frozen, a little embarrassed maybe about showing her face on the camera, that maybe, we may kind of translate it into our body being frozen or feeling frozen. So that's something usually I would bring up and discuss openly with the client and actually ask them how they feel, what's going on for them, to kind of check whether it's, a countertransference or something else. Is it something about them or about me? So I'd really inquire into this quite openly.
Sorry, we'll have another couple of questions, and then I think we'll need to wrap it up. But there are a couple of people here who are asking something similar, which is, do you ask permission of your clients to write about them in the book? And a related one, can Anastasia talk about confidentiality in relation to clients you have written about?
Yes, of course. That's a really, really important question. I think I write about this a little bit in the preface. And it's never easy to write about clients. And I think any therapist who writes, whether it's a blog, a case vignette, or a story, kind of has to face the question. So the way I dealt with it, and this is very clear, these stories are fictionalized. So no story in this book is the exact story of the exact real client. There are bits and pieces in every story. Obviously, there is something very, very real. But often there are a few client stories that are kind of mixed together and kind of rewritten as a story. There are a couple of stories, though, where I kind of wrote more about a real person consistently. And in those cases, yes, of course, I did ask their permission.
I wonder, Anastasia, if you've had any feedback from the clients who are Peter?
That's a wonderful question. And this is actually something I have been actively thinking about and maybe considering maybe writing about it, because I think it's really, really interesting how, as a therapist, it's the first time I write a book. So about cases, about clients. And of course, that has been, that resonated and has been resonating since the release of the book in my practice. So I decided to be very kind of active in using it for the clients' benefits. Kind of those who read the book, obviously I would suggest they do, but those who did, gave me really rich and wonderful feedback that every time ends up being extremely useful for our work. So, and those feedbacks are extremely different from one person to another, even if they're mainly positive. And, it's wonderful and it's heartwarming to see my clients excited to me, of course. but they are very different. They will pick up on different stories, on different aspects of their therapist writing about clients. Some will get a little paranoid, a little stressed, and will have to talk about trust. Others will be surprised. So I got all kind of responses, and excited or sad suddenly. So everything almost came up, and I've been really enjoying the process and trying to making it beneficial to them. So that's really an exciting kind of aspect of writing a book as a therapist.
Okay, I think we are about to wind down, but we have one more question. So I'll just ask that one from Anonymous. I am wondering how you manage the disinhibition that online therapy may bring, given that the patient is not in the room.
Inhibition, right?
The disinhibition. I'll read it again.
That's a very
how you manage the disinhibition. Yes.
I manage it with a lot of pleasure. It's a wonderful ally, I think, for the therapy work, because clients do tend, not all of them, but many clients do tend to reveal more about themselves, and they have more ways of doing that, right? They can bring you into their homes, they can show you certain aspects of their life, very tangible aspects. So they use it creatively. And I think as a therapist, it's important to respond to that and be ready to catch that information up. I almost never had anything like any client trying to push it too far. Even I had a client once who connected from his boss, and I managed to leverage that up to do good work. Obviously, he had some very deep unconscious reasons for doing that. So that, yeah, it brings a fascinating, material to the work.
And I think it's worth mentioning that disinhibition makes up a really large proportion of all the competencies that are available for online work, from the ones I'm referring to specifically, BACP and ACTO. Disinhibition is such a big part of the work, but I think it takes a certain attitude shift to come away from it as negative, and look at it as an opportunity to, as Anastasia says, the client will open up more readily, be more relaxed in what they're saying, and it moves the therapy on a lot faster as well. It does need managing, it needs titrating so that the client doesn't become overwhelmed excuse me, by what they're sharing. But yes, managing disinhibition, I find a pleasure in the work.
Yeah, and sometimes they will get overwhelmed because we cannot completely avoid that, So I don't try to avoid it. I try just to be very aware of what's going on, and kind of try to maybe sometimes slow down the pace. Sometimes it helps, of course. And if the client gets overwhelmed, then we work it through. We usually do have that opportunity to kind of work it through and make sure that they recover from that exposure of that shame that comes with it.
Cool.
Okay, well, thank you both, and indeed Mark as well, if you want to come back on and join us for the goodbyes. Thank you all so much for your time and your generosity in coming to help Anastasia and Confer Books celebrate the publication of her wonderful work. Thank you to everyone who's joined us online and for all of your fascinating questions. I just want to show my copy of the book here. I've got so many tags on here.
We could all do that.
Very impressive.
With the wonderful cover, which is actually the view that Anastasia is now looking at, although it's probably dark, is the view from her window with her computer. And I think that's a lovely tribute as well.
And this is something my clients never see, of course.
They never see that, of course. No, they don't. And the book is available, obviously, to purchase. And we're offering a 20% discount through the Karnak Bookshop. If you purchase it online, you can use the promotional code UNLOCKED20. And I think that's now valid until the 4th of March, which is next Friday. So don't delay. It just remains for me to thank everyone who's been involved in this wonderful event. There's my colleague Emily.
She's got a book as well.
Also sharing her book. And Emily will be sending around an email, a follow-up email with all of this information as well. So thank you all. And,
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I would like to thank everybody for being here, for me, for Confer, for the book. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, absolutely everybody, especially those who, haven't read the book and still came out of curiosity. Thank you. Thank you.